Hi, I'm Bob Ethington.
And I'm Nick Nicholas.
And this is From Akron and Beyond. Hi there, folks. How is everyone doing out there? And Nick, how are you?
Oh, great today.
Good, good. Well, I'm great as well because we have as our guest for this episode someone who almost epitomizes our phrase from Akron, because he's very much from Akron, even though he may want to deny it sometimes. And he's definitely gone very far beyond.
Very far.
And I'm talking about John Backderf. You know him as Derf. The world knows him as Derf, the very highly acclaimed and successful graphic artist, creator of comics and graphic novels. My Friend Dahmer, Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, Trashed, his book on Kent State. All are terrific, and we're going to get into all of these. But we probably should start from the very beginning, Nick.
Yeah, Derf, I know your history going back to the days of the Beacon Journal. Are you from Akron?
My family's from Akron, yeah. I was born in Akron, but I was raised in Richfield. My old man wanted to get out of the city.
At a very young age, you left?
Yeah, no. I was always in Richfield.
Oh, okay,
when I was a kid.
gotcha.
All my family was in Akron.
Okay.
My parents were both Akronites. I come from a long line of rubber workers. In fact, I broke the chain. I'm the first adult male since 1890 that didn't work for a rubber company.
Oh, man.
So,
wow.
Yeah, it's like the classic Akron pedigree.
You had the same experience with Mr. Segedy that was here, remember?
Yeah, right.
Same one. He broke the chain, too.
That's true, yes. And then, of course, you come from rubber company family, right?
Yeah, rubber dust, yeah.
Yeah, and
Rubber dust,
and my
yeah,
father,
absolutely.
too, worked for Goodyear. So there you go.
Here we are.
Right.
Okay, so you growing up in Richfield, which means, I guess at this point I should interject quickly that Derf and I are actually good friends, old friends, and we have some shared history a bit, although we didn't really know each other in high school. But I know that growing up in Richfield, that you went to the Revere schools, right?
That's right.
And what was Bath School? Was that the elementary?
No, Richfield Elementary.
Richfield was the
which
elementary.
is no longer there.
Yeah.
So pretty much the whole town is no longer there. It's a town of ghosts,
Yeah, it was big trucking
That's right.
business there,
Yeah,
right?
well,
right.
they for some reason decided to put all these highways through Richfield,
Yeah.
including one in my backyard.
Really?
So the trucks came with it. Yeah, it was a strange place to grow up. Really.
Yeah.
My old homestead on Fifth Avenue in Akron is the front yard of Hoban High School now, so I know what that's like.
Yeah. So, so then Lakeview is junior high? Am I getting
Eastview.
Eastview. I'm very
And then
confused.
Revere,
Lakeview's out where I live
and then
now.
Revere
so.
High School, yeah, and then
Revere
out,
High. Yeah,
out
okay.
and gone. It was okay. It was a nice place to grow up. It was very different from Akron because my mother was such an Akronite. We were constantly in Akron.
Right.
She never liked Richfield. So we would always come to Akron to do whatever, errands had to be done, and we're dragging into Akron all the time. So I was very much Akron-centric, mostly West Akron.
Mm-hmm.
Were you old enough, I think you would have been, to have gone to O'Neill's and Polsky's and stuff downtown?
Yeah, my grandfather was actually a cabinet maker at O'Neill's downtown.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
I know, it was cool. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah.
I thought Akron was the biggest city in the world when I was a little kid.
Sure, yeah.
The sidewalks were packed, and their streets were packed. We had trouble finding a place to park, and that's where I went to buy a lot of my comics. So that was really important as well because there was a corner drugstore in Richfield that had comics, and that's where I bought the bulk of them. But to find other stuff, you had to come into Akron, go to the old bookstores, go to the newsstands.
Yeah.
And so that was...
Oh, the old bookstores, man. I remember those.
Right. And the ones in Cleveland were even more awesome, like Kay's Books and Publix. But
Right.
So I was constantly on the search for comics when I was, from the time I was 5 years old on.
Do you remember the first comic you bought?
The comic book? Probably
Yeah.
Mad Magazine.
Okay,
I
yeah.
would think, yeah.
Okay.
The first comics I actually consumed were on the comics page of the Akron Beacon Journal.
Okay, sure.
Because, that was magic. It comes to your house. Here's these couple pages of comics, and I was immediately hypnotized by that. I don't really even know why.
Yeah.
Prince Valiant.
Prince Valiant?
Yeah,
that was
remember? Yeah.
No, that was not
I couldn't
my
read. That's
favorite.
before I knew how to read, but I loved the pictures.
Right. I was early on. I think it was Peanuts probably that really got me, and then I discovered Mad, and it was lights out after that.
Yeah.
So that was.
I guess I never thought of Mad as a comic book.
Oh, sure. Well, it's all comics.
Yeah. Well, true.
It's magazine.
I mean, when you explain it that way.
There
But I
were
bought
there
Mad
were
all the
probably
time, and
there were
I-
probably
yeah.
5 generations of comics creators who were heavily influenced by Mad.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was one of them. So it was Spy versus Spy and Don
Yeah,
Martin,
that was
Don
great.
Martin and Sergio Aragonis and all the rest of them.
Right. Right.
And I think I had a stack of them about 3 feet high besides my bed.
I used to always like those paperbacks that
Oh
came
yeah,
out,
yeah.
right? That
Mad was everywhere. You
yeah.
couldn't escape it. I mean,
Yeah.
you'd go to every church garage sale and be a stack of Mads for 5 for 10 cents.
Right.
So you could there were millions of these things printed, and the books, as you say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I was just awash in Mad Magazine, and
And
then
it's
it just
funny because
progressed from there.
because you were getting the books, they were like these sort of omnibus volumes, right? And so I'd be reading them. They're doing Adlai Stevenson jokes.
There was definitely there was a lot of it that was of its time. Yeah, you're reading an old Mad magazine you got at a garage sale, and they're talking about McCarthy, and,
right.
and Nixon, and it's like what is this? What does this have to do with anything? I don't know. And you figured it out.
Right. Well, no, it was.
You still are questioning that.
I was going to say, that's how I learned a lot of history, was from things like that. I mean, literally, probably is.
Yeah.
When did you first get when did you first decide to put pencil to paper? Like you wanted to draw these things yourself?
I don't remember a time when I wasn't.
Oh,
When you
I mean,
wasn't.
I have comic strips I drew when I was 6 years old.
wow.
And I was constantly drawing, which got me in a lot of trouble, actually, especially in school.
in math
But
class.
my mother, God bless her, always backed me up. I remember she was hauled in one day because I wouldn't stop drawing in class. They'd teacher take away my paper, I'd draw on the book. She'd take away the book, I'd draw on the desk. She'd yell at me for that, I'd draw on my pants leg. And finally, she just called my mother in and said, he won't stop drawing. And my mother said, so? Let him draw. He still hears you. He's listening.
Yeah.
Just let him draw. He has to draw.
Right.
And the teacher had trouble with that. But
It was like a compulsion in a way.
Yeah, I think it
in
is.
a good
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's something I've always done, and obviously always will. So
How conscious, you have a very distinct visual style. And we can get into maybe a little more detail on that when we're talking about later work, more recent stuff you've done. But I'm just curious, did that just come to you naturally?
no,
Or is that something
that's working the craft.
Okay.
Absolutely. I started out actually fairly traditionally. I started out at Ohio State.
Okay.
Working for the school paper, The Lantern.
So having graduated from Revere.
I
you went to Ohio
graduated from
State.
Revere. I did comics all through Revere, and mostly subversive comics like fake student council posters and things like that, trying to upend the everyday activities of the school, and got in some trouble for that too.
Sure, right.
But when I got to college, I got serious, and I was working for The Lantern, which published 35,000 copies a day.
Wow.
It was a free paper, and everybody read it.
Yeah.
And it was this massive broadsheet, probably, I don't know, anywhere from 30 to 50 pages, full of comics, student comics. It was all student work.
Wow.
And that was an opportunity. So it took me a while to get on the paper. It took me 3 attempts, but I would not be deterred. I had this relentlessness that I think has always served me well. And once that happened, I was doing political cartoons. I can't remember even why I decided to do political cartoons. Honestly, I think it was because they were printed bigger than the comic strips. And I thought I would have more room. And I just kind of got caught into that and thought, well, I'll see where this goes. So they were very typical political cartoons, and I was never happy with that.
Yeah.
I had these cartoons in my head. I wanted to be experimental. I wanted to be more of a, doing groundbreaking work, but I just couldn't get there. I was too young. I was going
to say you're probably like 19 or 20 or something.
I was 20, I think, when I started at the Lantern. So I just needed to grow up a little and experience things and take in outside influences.
Right.
A lot of that was, punk and new wave and art and what was happening in the culture at that time in the 80s.
Yeah.
And, that filtered into my work, and then slowly it started to morph. But, yeah, it took a long time.
Yeah. Now, when you are done at Ohio State, you had some adventures at Ohio State. Am I correct that you didn't have some of your work get you in a little controversy?
God. Yeah, I was throwing hand grenades right and left. I've always had really kind of a natural talent for really pissing people off. And yeah, I did some cartoons about the football team that got me in a lot
the
of
one
hot
thing
water.
that's sacred, you can't touch.
Oh my God.
There was one. I actually had to leave town for a couple days because I was getting death threats. The athletic director wanted me thrown out of school. I mean, it got
severe.
Ugly.
Wow.
It got ugly, but it's a great experience and a great lesson.
Yeah.
In the power of the work,
right,
and the power of cartoons.
Yeah,
way before the internet, man, it just blew up through.
This was before the internet.
Yeah. Wow.
And then later, when I started doing the city, I was able to channel that more sharply and be surgical strikes rather than just big blasts that kind of blew up in my face.
Were you still a student when you started?
No, that
city?
came later. That came later. Yeah.
So you graduate from Ohio State,
right?
And then, is there further school after that, or is that it?
No,
that's it.
After Ohio State, I was a cartoonist at the Lantern for 3 full years.
Okay.
So I really developed a lot, but I like I said, I wasn't happy with it. But I decided to see, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
Professionally, which was kind of crazy because at the time there were maybe 350 political cartoonists in the whole country.
Oh.
I mean, that's not a profession.
Right.
But I pulled it off. I got a job.
Yeah.
And at a paper in Florida.
Wow.
And I was also signed with a small syndicate just when I left college. So just like that, I was a pro.
Okay. Yeah.
And I did it for a couple years, and I really...
Was that the early days of the city, or was that called something else?
No, this is political cartoons.
Okay, it was political. Okay,
yeah.
All right.
But I wasn't happy with it. I wasn't happy with the constraints. I wasn't happy with the work.
Mm-hmm.
So I left Florida, and that's when I came back to Ohio. I got a job with a plain dealer, actually. I think I was 25.
Okay.
And just doing all different kinds of... I was a staff cartoonist, so I was doing all kinds of big, full-page cartoons, and I was also doing political cartoons. I was the backup political cartoonist. Even though I didn't want to do it, they forced me to do it.
Yeah.
But because I didn't want to do it, I was really freed mentally. It's like, all right, well, you're going to make me do it. I'm just going to go crazy.
Right.
So I started experimenting with medium, and I was doing collage and scratch board and all this crazy stuff, and just stretching and pulling and not doing typical cartoons. And
that's kind of an interesting point because you didn't have anything really invested in it particularly. You had no constraints on you.
Right. Exactly true.
So it was more being like what would be inspiring to you was the art techniques and what you were trying to do artistically.
And you could do it,
Just trying to free my mind, really.
Sure, yeah.
And
your pen will follow.
The pen will follow, exactly.
I knew you were going to say.
Oh, that's terrible.
Sorry. Please continue.
And after 2 years, I'd had enough of the plain dealer, which was a horrible place to work. So I just dropped the mic and walked out and quit. And much to their surprise, and holed up in my studio for a year just seeing what I could produce.
Interesting.
And
so this is the first time that you're striking out on your
my own.
On a total,
Right.
You will do it again.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is the first time.
Okay.
And it took it, I'm late 20s by this point.
Yeah.
And it took that long to kind of shake that Germanic pragmatism of my Akron, gene pool, and just take a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked out pretty well. I was doing a lot of different comics. I was doing single panel gag cartoons, which were pretty experimental. I mean, they were not typical. And short stories. I did short stories, and I started working on this comic strip.
Yeah.
Just free-form comic strip. I didn't even have a name for it. And all of his stuff began to come together. The gag cartoons I actually sold first.
Okay.
I had probably 3 or 4 clients who were buying those every week.
So would they used to be magazines or newspapers?
Yeah. There was a magazine called Fast Company.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I remember that. It was a pretty glossy magazine.
Yeah.
A couple others.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my first actual success with this stuff. But I was interested in this comic strip, which I thought had potential. And we're talking late 80s at this point. And what was happening in the publishing world were these new papers were popping up everywhere called alt weeklies or weekly city papers. They're free papers that you used to find stacks of them in front of every coffee shop in any big major city, blowing down the street in front of the coffee shop. And they were great.
It needs to be like the Scene magazine. People
Not like Scene, no.
Not really?
Scene was still a bar rag at that time.
Okay.
The one in Cleveland was called the Edition, Cleveland Edition. And they were smart. They were hip. They covered music and culture and sometimes politics.
Was there any in the Akron area?
Not at that time, no. Every big city had one, and some of them were phenomenally successful. Mm-hmm. Like the Chicago Reader was the size of a phone book every week. They were just huge.
Yeah.
And they were packed with comics. And they were these new comics because they were comics that were being done by people that couldn't find any way to get their comics in print.
Right, yeah.
But they were amazing. Like Matt Groening was doing Life in Hell, and Linda Barry, and really a who's who of creators who would go on to become A-listers.
Right.
In the medium very shortly after that. And I thought, heck, I can try something like this. So that's when I developed this strip.
Mm-hmm.
And after a couple months, I really liked what was coming together. I looked it over and was like, well, what is this thing? I mean, how am I going to pitch this? What is it about?
Right.
And as I was looking them over, well, they're all about a 20-something hipster living in a big city.
Right, yeah.
So I thought, okay, I'll call it The City. And I packaged it up and mailed it into the editor of the Cleveland Edition, and he called me the next day and said, let's run this starting next week.
Nice.
Wow.
And so I drew a big cover page for that issue, and it debuted that week, and man, it just hit like a bomb. I mean, I've never had that kind of reaction to anything I'd done before.
Right.
I mean, I get a lot of reaction at Ohio State with those cartoons, but that was a different kind of thing. This was like a huge breakthrough.
Yeah.
And I just kept, I've been chasing that buzz ever since.
And those would run weekly then?
What?
The city strips were weekly?
It was a weekly strip.
Yeah.
Which was a great gig because, you'd take me a day and a half to do a strip, and the rest of the week was my own.
Yeah, right.
And when I started making money with it, that was a really great gig.
Yeah, right.
Because about maybe after the first year, I don't think it was that long, maybe 8 or 9 months, I decided to start sending it out to other weekly papers around the country, and they snapped it up. And so then I was in 10 papers, and 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, and all the way up to, I think I peaked at 75, 80.
Man, that's amazing.
So you draw one strip and you get paid for it 80 times.
Yeah.
You know, that's how it works.
Right.
And it was a great ride in the 90s, especially. It was a lot of fun, and I thought I was doing good work. So
those have been sort of a best of has been collected, right?
a little bit, yeah. A lot of that stuff was the problem with my work in particular with that strip is that it's very of its time.
I was going to say a little dated, maybe like.
Well, it just belongs in the 90s.
In the 90s, right? Yeah,
that's where it was,
right?
And not
it wasn't dated when people were reading.
No,
it.
no, it was in the moment.
Yeah, right, right.
I mean, I would draw a strip, and 2 days later, it'd be in print.
Right, right.
Which is the great thing about newspaper comics.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is unlike any other form of comics.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're really in the moment, and you're writing about what people are talking about and thinking about, but that fades. You know, it vanishes very quickly.
Yeah.
And more than that, I was really known in the 90s for that kind of savage snark that was the staple of that strip. And you know, snark is not as accepted anymore. Certainly, we reached a point where it was like, no, this is no longer appropriate.
Right, right.
And I'm okay with that.
Sure,
you know, things change.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I look back at that time, and I mean, a lot of my colleagues are, you know, they lament losing that form, but my attitude is, hey man, everything has its time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all did it for 10, 15 years, and then it was time to do something else. But I enjoyed doing it, and I really liked playing with the art form. And you know, the work I was doing, there weren't a lot of people doing work like that.
Right, right.
And I'm very proud of that. It had an impact. I would see imitators popping up, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
As long as I didn't steal too many of my clients. And I thought I made my mark.
Yeah.
Even if it was not permanent. I thought that I was happy with the work, and I was proud of it, especially early on. The first 5 years were really just a blast.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
there was no drudgery at all at that point, right?
No,
it was just the inspiration
none.
was new.
I drew a lot faster back then too. Now it's like a a monk bent over a parchment for a year and a half. But back then it was just free and loose, and you know, I'd spit these things out, and I could do anything. You know, it was so experimental, it was so wide open. So it could be topical, it could not be topical, it could be sad.
Yeah.
It could be surreal.
Right.
I was doing a lot of that back then too. And as the decade progressed, the 90s I'm talking about here, it got a little more locked down because editors wanted something that was more, you know, tied to their vision of their papers. And the business got a lot more corporate too, which was crazy, you know.
Yeah.
Corporate old weeklies. Okay, sure. What's alternative about that? But
Yeah, I was going to say you were. I mean, we've had several guests on our show who worked in or were related in some respect with the newspaper industry, and so they're all roughly in the same age group as all of us are, and so basically they got to see this sort of slow dying
apocalypse.
Yeah. And that affected you. I remember at the time.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
it was like
yeah.
this one paper after the other closing and stuff, right?
Well, I saw it coming. Luckily,
Yeah.
I mean, you got to keep you've got to pay attention when you're doing a business like this,
Right.
And in the 90s especially, I remember when it happened, late 90s. Suddenly, particularly with the all weeklies, they were built on the personals and the classifieds. It was just page after page of
right.
agate type, and this was a cash cow.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was really the backbone of these papers. Well, then along comes the internet, and suddenly the personals vanish.
Right, right.
And then right after it comes Craigslist, and then the classifieds vanish. And I just thought, yeah, this isn't good. And even more relevant, that's where the comics lived. They lived back with the classifieds and the personal, that page after page of agate type, you drop a really heavily drawn comic strip in the middle of it, it just leaps off the page.
Right, yeah.
And it was really, a dramatic placement of comics. I think it's one of the reasons they were so successul.
Yeah, yeah.
But, that all that stuff dried up, and I was like, yep, I better come up with a plan B here at that point.
Sure.
But I was still having fun with it, and I was still, making money, but it was a big part of my identity.
Sure.
But, yeah, you like I said, everything has its time.
Yeah. So this is From Akron and Beyond. I'm Bob Ethington with my co-host Nick Nicholas, and we are speaking with our guest, the comic artist and graphic novelist, Derf. Now, so the city is kind of slowly probably coming to an end due to a number of things. And then you had your own issues, personal issues, health-wise, right?
I got cancer, that was fun.
And that, which
like everyone from Akron, right?
Speaking of coming to an end, yeah.
Oh, no, not that way.
Well, he emerged victorious. That's the important part. And more than just living on, which is what we're like having you around, Derf, is that it also kind of... I'm curious to hear your take on this. Did this cause, or was it just part of this really total rejuvenation of your career that turned into a whole new phase for you that's been so successful?
It certainly came, it was certainly concurrent. I think there was probably some motivation there. Mm-hmm. But the amazing thing about that time is that when I was in chemo for a year, chemo and radiation, I never missed a deadline.
Wow.
I produced that comic strip every friggin' week. Mm-hmm. And, I could, it was maybe in pretty bad shape, but I never missed a deadline.
Yeah.
There was already stuff happening in my own head at that point. I mean, like what we were just talking about, I was already thinking of a plan B. And probably the mid-'90s I started, which is almost 10 years before I got cancer. Mm-hmm. Okay. I started thinking about long-form stuff and started experimenting and writing some short stories. I had the Dahmer stuff, which is, for those of you who don't know it, I went to junior high and high school with Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah.
And I had this concept of maybe doing something with that. I wasn't sure what. It was going to be long-form. So it was going to be short stories or a book. But I didn't really have I hadn't acquired the skills to tell a story like that. Okay. Because the city, for those of you who remember, it was very absurd. It was, this exploding satire with very cartoonish, very... the style I always called post-punk expressionism.
Okay.
And so
it's fitting, yeah.
It was just not, it was fitting for that,
yeah.
But it wasn't fitting for telling this very dark, melancholy story of Jeff Dahmer.
Right.
And so I had a lot of material, but I hadn't done anything with it. And I was also, I had my own issues to deal with as well.
Sure.
With this story. It wasn't until he was killed that I actually sat down and started writing stuff. Mm-hmm. So that was what, I want to say 94, but I could be wrong. I've forgotten all my Dahmer trivia. And then the other story I had was about my career as a garbage man.
Right.
Which we kind of skipped over.
Yeah,
before
I was trying to figure out where to interject that.
Right.
So, yeah.
When I left high school, I went to art school briefly. Right after high school, I mean, I just wanted to get out of Akron.
Yeah.
So 2 weeks after high school, I went to art school in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
Which was the first time I lived in a big city, actually. And we were right downtown. I mean, it was. And I didn't think much of the art school, but I loved living in the city. So I stuck at the art school for maybe 6 months, and that didn't work out, and I was kind of dejected and just like, oh, God, what am I going to do now? So I came home and I had to find work. I had to find a job. Yeah. And if you guys remember, this would have been 79.
Okay.
You know, crappy jobs were kind of hard to find back then because most jobs were pretty good jobs.
Right.
Like if you went into O'Neill's or something, those guys were actually, they'd worked there for 30 years.
Yeah,
they were making a living.
Yeah.
They didn't have places like Target or Starbucks.
Yeah, that's right. That was like all that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you couldn't even get a job at a record store unless you were a musical expert or something.
So you knew Ethington.
Yeah, like Ethington.
I know
here.
Bob. Yeah.
So this was the only job I could find. It was joining the garbage crew in Richfield. So here I was, 19-year-old college dropout, working in my hometown on a garbage truck. I might as well have just painted a big orange L on my forehead.
I was a parking lot attendant for 2 or 3 years during college. You know, I worked at downtown Akron. Held up at gunpoint twice and robbed.
Oh, wow.
But, I mean, you know, we all have those kind of jobs.
Well, garbage man is something completely different, my friend. Let me tell you. And so it was a great experience. It was, I say it all the time, garbage made a man out of me. You know, and I needed that. I needed to grow up. Mm-hmm. And I needed to put on some muscle, and that
well, that was before
25 pounds of muscle from that.
I was going to say that was during the times when they didn't have those automatic arms.
No, it was all by hand.
Yeah,
it was all by hand. The robot garbage trucks are fairly new.
Yeah,
but I had these great stories from that too. So these are the two books. These are the two really significant stories I had in my pocket that I wanted to get to. And I kind of played around with them and wasn't really happy with it. But it was in the early 2000s, I think 2002, which was actually the same year I got cancer.
Okay.
So it was concurrent.
Yeah.
I found a publisher to put out a magazine-sized collection of garbage truck stories.
Yeah.
And I self-published some of my Dahmer short stories just to see if anyone would be interested in what I could do with them.
Yeah.
They were both not very good, I don't think. But they both got Eisner Award nominations, which are the Oscars of comics.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay.
Well, they were pretty,
I'm on the right track
They
here.
were pretty good. It's just that how you ultimately did with that is so much more developed and better. But
it was raw. It was raw.
Yeah.
But it had some spirit to it.
Sure.
And then right after I got word that I got the Eisner nominations, then I was diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a bummer.
Yeah.
So that, then I had to work through that, and that I lost a couple years to that. And but when I came out of the other end of it, I was like, all right, let's continue on. Let's get back to this and really throw myself into it. But I was still doing the city as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I had a lot on my plate.
But I mean, I don't want to, conjecture in a way that it's none of my business, but just knowing you and knowing you at that time, it seems to me that there had to be an element of, wow, you faced mortality, literally.
Yeah, several times.
And it's like, if you can emerge from that, there's got to be a feeling of like, I have to use this time the best I can. And, right? I'm thinking, and so when you had these projects kind of stewing anyway, it was kind of like the impetus maybe to say, I'm going to, I'm going to pursue this more ambitious work.
It was. Yeah. It was. I think that I stopped taking it as, I was kind of at a languid pace before that, and I picked up speed.
Right.
Like, all right, let's get going here. And the other thing was, it suddenly I'm like 40 years old. It's like, how the hell did that happen?
Oh, sure.
And it's like, quit screwing around, you know? I mean, and I knew the newspaper stuff was ending. I knew that didn't have a very positive future. It's like, why waste time with that? So it was really about that time that I flipped my own resume on its head. Before that, I was a comic strip artist who dabbled in long form comics. Well, now I was a long form comics artist who dabbled in comic strips.
Yeah, right.
And my motivations changed completely.
Sure.
And that was a big moment.
So the book My Friend Dahmer, that was no, it was not the first.
No, it wasn't
was
the
it?
first.
Okay.
It was the first. My Friend Dahmer had a very long gestation. Like I said, the story happened in 1992,
right?
Which was just blew up my world.
Sure.
In many ways, I describe it this way. I'm sitting there, and it's at that point 13 years after high school, and I've made peace with Revere High and all of the stuff that happened in Richfield, and I'm okay with it. It's not something I treasure, but it's like fine.
Right.
I had a good time. I made some good friends who I'm still friends with. And then one day, just like that, my entire personal history is rewritten.
Wow.
And all of this goofy stuff that we had done in high school, which Dahmer was a part of because he was, hanging out with us, suddenly it takes on this very chilling new meaning.
Right. Oh, my God, yeah.
As we realize, oh, my God, that's what he was thinking when we were doing this stuff.
Right, yeah.
And all of these close encounters that we had, like at one point, we were within yards of that first body.
Yeah, wow.
And so, that messes with your head.
Yeah. Like you said, it rewrote those years. Yeah.
Yeah. So that took a while to deal with. And then it was working out how to tell the story to acquire the skills I needed, because I had to almost completely change my drawing style and my writing style. There's a big difference between writing a comic strip, which is 4 or 5 panels, then out. You have your own beat. You have its own little story within that very short frame.
Right.
So there's a big difference between that and then moving on to a graphic novel where you're telling that story over 200, 300 pages.
Right, right.
And you've got story arcs and subplots and, narrative, all kinds of narrative requirements. That takes a completely different mindset in writing and in drawing. And so that took a little time.
But before Dahmer, you did punk rock and trailer parks.
Yeah. Well, sort of.
Okay.
Like I said, Dahmer had this long gestation. I actually had 3 drafts of My Friend Dahmer before I finally got one that I was happy with, which became the finished book. So I kept doing these drafts and then looking at them and going, well, this is crap, and throwing it out and starting over again.
Wow.
So the first draft was in 98. I think I did another one in early 2000s, and then another one in the mid-2000s, and then finally the final one. But after maybe the second or third draft, it's just like, man, I'm just not getting this. I need to really learn how to be a graphic novelist before I tackle this for the final time, because I figured I'm only going to get one shot at it.
Right, yeah.
I'm going to publish this book, and good or bad, that's going to be it, and then the story's done.
Right.
And I didn't want to squander that opportunity.
Sure.
So that is when I said, all right, I'm going to go off and tell a book that nobody really gives a crap about. And if it stinks, no one will care. And that's when I started working on punk rock and trailer parks, and that was right in the middle of the cancer stuff.
Right, right.
So
that ties into Akron.
Yeah.
It ties into
big time.
days
Yeah.
of the,
I can confidently state it is the only graphic novel ever written about Akron.
Yeah.
It is
The Bank, which we've mentioned many times, plays a key role in that book. Yes.
Well, there's all sorts of stuff that you guys are involved in, actually.
Yeah.
I started working on that book. I was on vacation, actually, in Canada. So I took my family up there to this lake I used to go to when I was a kid, because I was done with chemo, I was done with radiation. It's like, I need a break.
Mm-hmm.
So we went up there, and every day I would drag an Adirondack chair down to the lake and stick my feet in along with a 6-pack of beer and sit there and just work on a sketchbook and figure out what I could come up with.
Mm-hmm.
And I came up with this great character, this protagonist called Otto, who, I don't know where he came from. He just materialized out of nowhere. And I had some really fun anecdotes, but that's all I had. So I had a couple characters, I had some great scenes, but I didn't have anything else. I didn't have motivation, I didn't have a plot, I didn't have a hero's journey, I didn't have any of this stuff.
Right.
And I struggled with that for a year or two. And what changed everything was you guys. When you had that benefit for Tin Huey. What year was that? 2005?
I don't remember, Bob.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got to be.
So it was at the Old Lime Spider.
Yeah.
It was all these decrepit punk bands reuniting.
We tried, yep.
And playing the music again. And that's, I used to hang out at the bank. I used to hang out at JB's when I was in high school. And I saw you guys in your quote-unquote prime.
Yes.
And so it was just a great evening, and it was a weekend, right?
It was 2 days,
2 days.
Friday, Saturday.
Yeah.
And I was involved because I created the poster. I forget who asked me. Maybe you, Bob.
I did, yeah.
And we turned that into a T-shirt, and we had a merch table, and we were, doing our bit to raise funds for this benefit. And I remember the moment exactly. It was on the second night, and I'm standing in the middle of the floor. I can't remember who was playing, but I'm just standing there kind of grooving to it all and taking in this vibe, and it just transported me right back to the bank. It just felt like the same spirit and the same counterculture community, this clubhouse.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there, and it was like suddenly there was a shaft of light that came down and, heavenly music. And I said, of course, I'll set this story in the bank in 1979 or 1980.
Yeah.
And that week I went home and I wrote that book in 2 days.
Oh, wow.
It all just snapped together. I had everything. And then that was a lot of fun recreating that world because there's not a lot of documentation about that era. It's not like
a couple videos and that's it.
It's not like CBGB's where everybody there was a photographer, a filmmaker.
Yeah, right.
At the bank, they were all like, I don't know, rubber workers, milkmen, garbage men.
Yeah.
And nobody had anything. Nobody had a camera. Nobody had anything. That era is just kind of lost, except for a few scraps. So this was my chance to really recreate it and show people what it was like. And what came out of that was Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, and that was my first book.
I remember talking with you at the time when you were writing it about the exact layout of the bank, like where the bar was, what side of the room it was on, the balcony, all that stuff.
Right.
And you captured it amazingly well.
The key to that was talking to people like you guys, and I mean that was my journalism training right there. Because I was a journalism major at Ohio State. You just go out and talk to people.
Yeah.
But it was getting those key details from you, and then David Giffels actually found the photo file of the bank in the Beacon Journal Photo Morgue.
Okay.
And it took him a while to find it, but I guess I called in a favor. He did it out of the goodness of his heart. And he copied that off and sent it to me. And I had actual photo reference of what the interior looked like, right down to the crappy chairs.
Beautiful,
and the tables and a lot of the details. The mirrors on the wall.
Pinball
and
machines.
that was really key. So, yeah, I think it's probably the most detailed visual record of the bank that exists.
Yeah.
Just because there's nothing else.
Right. Yeah.
And that was a lot of fun. That book was just a pure joy to produce.
Now, you mentioned writing the book in a couple of days.
Yeah.
So when you're writing the book, do you just write the text to it? Or are you like already imagining how the panels are going to be drawn?
Sure. Yeah. Writing to me is, they're called thumbnails.
Okay.
So it's like on a maybe 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and it's just like stick figures and sketches. And, and then I write in word balloons, and I write in the dialogue and the narration. So it's always words and pictures
together.
So
it's attached to a visual in your...
Yeah, they're never separate.
Okay.
Now, sometimes with a more complicated work, like, some of my nonfiction stuff, I'll need to do timelines and factual, getting the facts correct and everything like that.
Right.
So that's separate. But when I actually write the narrative, it's always words and pictures together, never separated.
Yeah.
That's just how I see them. They play like little film clips in my head, and I get them down as quickly as I can, and then, the slow, long slog of making pages. Punk Rock and Trailer Parks actually came together fairly quick. That was maybe a little over a year to produce that book.
Mm-hmm.
That's fast.
Yeah.
I've slowed down considerably since then.
Yeah.
But the books I've taken on are much more complicated.
Oh, sure.
And that was fiction. So even though it's based on a real place, it was fiction. And there's a big difference between writing fiction and writing nonfiction.
Right.
I enjoy both, but fiction is more pleasurable, honestly.
Yeah.
It's less of a struggle.
Yeah. Did you have I'm trying to remember if you had like a playlist for that.
I
book.
did.
Yeah.
I did. You can still find it. It's like on Spotify. It's
Yeah.
on YouTube. People really got off on that. I was surprised. I just put it in there because I thought it was so key.
Right.
And there's some Akron bands in there, which those cuts are pretty hard to find. But there's also some, the Pretenders and Devo and all the rest of that stuff. Mainly music that was important to me. I think in a perfect world, there would have been like a little barcode on the page, and you could just scan it, and then they would play along as you were. But we didn't have that technology when that book came out. The book was published at the very end of 2009.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much has changed in
Even then,
15 years. But
I'm sure the Ramones are an important part of the
Ramones
playlist.
were there.
The Clash,
the
too,
Ramones were
probably.
there.
Yeah.
That was one of my first, an early show, the Ramones.
Yeah.
And all the shows that are depicted in the story, the Ramones, the Plasmatics, Chai Pig's in there. I put them in there. I forget who else. Ian Dury and the Blockheads. Just these Klaus Nomi.
Yeah.
Those are all shows I went to. But I think the only show that from Akron would be Klaus Nomi and Chai Pig.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was mostly a punk rocker in Columbus. Because that's where I was going to school. Sure. And you guys all came down there, of course. There were Akron bands there every weekend.
Yeah, we played there.
But that's mostly where I consume that stuff. So some of those shows are in there, like the Plasmatic Show and things like that.
Right.
It was fun. I just had a blast with that book.
Right.
And it was really received very well.
Mm-hmm. It is a fun book.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Even more so, believe it or not, in Europe. It's got a big following in Europe.
Really?
And various foreign translations.
Which is a good place for us, I think, to take a break here and just call this part one of this long-form interview with Derf, because we will now be moving on to, yes, indeed, Europe and the reception to his work in his later part of his career, and a little more in-depth dive into the book that really started it all, and that would be his book on Jeffrey Dahmer, My Friend Dahmer. So that's going to do it for this time. And with my co-host, Nick Nicholas.
See you later.
This has been Bob Ethington, and we will see you next time.